held with Mr. Walter A. Tam at his home, Rehov Balfour, 18. The interview is conducted by Naomi Bar Yosef. Mr. A. Tam, can you please briefly trace your involvement with Jewish affairs and the Anglo-Jewish community, firstly till you left England in 1946, and then when you settled here and became Director of the Civil Service and then the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in fact can you bring us up to the present time in this outline, but just to leave out the work that you did with Patois, because I'd like to ask you that in detail, and also I'd like to ask you about Jewish student life in detail in Oxford on a later question.
Okay, you've asked a tremendous question, and I think it's many years as I thought about the past, especially about that remote past, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to fill you in.
I'm fine.
So we start right from the beginning?
No, just continue.
Okay. I used to take an interest in Jewish matters in a general sort of way, but in fact my active involvement, what I would call my active involvement, began when Hitler came to power in Germany. I still remember very well the exact moment. It was on the 30th of January in 1933 when I was walking up the High Street in Oxford, and a newspaper boy came running down the street the other way, selling the Evening News or the Evening Standard or the Star, one of those papers. Those were the evening papers at that time in England, with the big placard saying Hitler appointed Chancellor of Germany. And I remember saying to myself, well, the Zionists were right after all. That was the moment of my conversion to Zionism. Before that, I'd been active in the Oxford University Jewish Society. I think I was the president or the chairman of the Jewish Society, but that was the normal kind of thing. I don't think there's anything special to be said about it. It was the society existed. It was active, but nothing very exceptional about it. The moment that happened, on January the 30th, 1933, I decided that if the Zionists were right, I'd better read up Zionist literature, none of which I'd ever read before. So I started reading everything I could. I read the entire works of Theodor Herzl, every single word of the diaries and everything else. I read Pinsker, and I read A.D. Gordon and all the other Zionist classics. And I did this fairly intensively for several months, and then decided that I'd better go out and have a look for myself at Palestine, which I did in the following year, in 1934. And during the first 15 minutes after I landed, it must have been towards the end of June 1934, I decided that this was a place for me, and that this was where I was going to spend the rest of my life. Well, I couldn't do so then immediately. By this time I was teaching at Oxford. I had obligations to go back to. But during the 1930s, I went back several times, at least 3 times, and then came the war, and that made a break in everyone's life. But it really made a very good break in a way in my life, because it was quite clear that I wasn't going to start up again at Oxford when the war was over, but that I would come to what then still was Palestine, and so at the earliest opportunity I did. Having been there before, I knew I think all the Jewish leaders of the time, Dr. Weizmann, Mr. Ben-Gurion, Mr. Sharet, all those people, and in fact, I had met Mr. Sharet once or twice, even during the war, when he came to England, and he had made a number of suggestions to me for things which I could do or should do when I came, and one of them was to set up a training school, sort of college, for the people who would be the future senior civil servants of the future Jewish state. And this was what I did. We set that up in 1946, and it went on gradually growing smaller and smaller as people went off to join the Haganah and as the fighting started. And then, and this was in Jerusalem. I was in Jerusalem right throughout the siege of Jerusalem, and when the independence of Israel was proclaimed, I was appointed Director General of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and then the rest of my career was in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to ask various questions that can shed light on Anglo Jewry in the 30s and 40s. And first of all, about PATWA, the Professional and Technical Workers Aliyah. I understand you, together with Eli Davis, who became director of Hadassah, started the organization in 1943. Is this correct? And can you talk about PATWA and the reasons that inspired you to form such an organization?
Inspiration is a big word, but I'll tell you the history as briefly as I can. I started the war as a trooper in the Royal Armoured Corps, but I found myself transferred very quickly after a few months after the winter of 1940-41 to another place which remained secret until a very short time ago, until a few years ago, but which now has become public knowledge, and that was the government establishment at Bletchley, which dealt with the deciphering of enemy codes, German, Italian, and others. Well, at this establishment in Bletchley, there was a small number of Jews, maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe 12, and in the nature of things we got to know one another, and we got into the habit fairly soon of meeting in the lodgings of one of them, Joe Gillis, who afterwards became a professor of mathematics at the Weizmann Institute. One evening a week, I can't remember whether it was Tuesday evening or Wednesday evening, it doesn't matter anyway, but one evening a week, all those Jews employed at Bletchley, who were free and who were able to come, used to meet regularly at Joe Gillis's place. And it turned out in the course of a conversation that many of us, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, probably most of us, were thinking of going and settling in Palestine as soon as the war was over. And so we started thinking about it, and we came to the conclusion that it would be a great deal easier if we did it in some sort of organized way. In other words, if we did it together, not necessarily as a group, not all going out together, but as an individual undertaking, it would be one thing, but if there were several people or a good many people, we could probably help one another. And so we decided to establish this organization. For a long time we were bothered by the name, because we realized it was not going to be Hechalutz. We were not Chalutzim in the sense in which the word Chalutz was understood at that time. But we were all people with university degrees, professionally trained people, and so we thought it would be a professional organization, but then we thought it would be widened to include people with technical knowledge, and so we called it the Professional and Technical Workers Aliyah. We didn't like the name because it didn't sound nice. Patwa didn't sound nice. If it had been called Patra or something like that, it would have been much more harmonious to the ear, but we couldn't think of a suitable word that started with R, so we had to make do with Patra. When we decided on this, we gave it some kind of publicity. I cannot now remember exactly what, but it must have been in a letter to the Jewish Chronicle or something of that kind. And we because we assumed that there must be other people in England who were thinking along similar lines, and we invited people to communicate with us. I took upon myself to be the organizer and the secretary, and we prepared forms which I had printed and which people who wrote in were asked to fill out and to send back, which they did, together with some very, very modest subscription, which I think was something like 5 shillings, or simply to cover the cost of postage and things of that kind. And one of the people who wrote in was Eli Davis, who lived at that time somewhere in southeast London, I think, and there were a number of others. And at some stage, I cannot now remember at which stage, at some stage we decided to hold a meeting of all these people, because so far we knew each other, we who were in Bletchley, but all the others we knew only by the forms which they filled in and sent to us. So we organized a meeting. The meeting was held somewhere in London. I have a feeling it was held in somebody's house in Eaton Avenue in Hampstead, but I'm not quite sure. And among those who turned up, of course, was Dr. Davis, and quite a respectable little crowd of other people. One of them was a man called Nat Goldenberg, who became the senior food chemist at Marks and Spencer. And it was at that meeting, if I am not mistaken, that we formally elected officers. Dr. Eli Davis was elected the chairman or the president, and I was the secretary. In other words, I continued doing what I had been doing. I don't remember now who the others were, and so Patra got to going, and we saw to it that from time to time its doings were reported in the Jewish Chronicle, and more people joined. I don't think that at the height of Patra we had more than maybe 50 or 60 members, something like that. It was nothing like a mass movement, but in a sort of way it was a what you might call a quality movement, because as I said, it was designed specifically for people with professional and technical qualifications. Of those who were members of Patra, some, maybe most, I simply don't remember, some, maybe most, fell by the wayside. Of those who came here, apart from myself and Dr. Davis and Dr. Gillis, of course, the ones that I remember best were a group of nurses. There must have been about 10 or 12 nurses who joined up. They were all of them, or certainly most of them, girls who had come originally from Germany and had come, I imagine, shortly before the war, had worked in British hospitals during the war, had acquired first-class British qualifications as state-registered nurses, and all those girls came in a group with us to Palestine, and one or two have since died, but of those who came, I still have contact with, I won't say with all of them, but certainly with 3 or 4 or 5 of them. In fact, most of them, I think, are now retired, because, you know, a lot of, this was all a long time ago. This was 40 years ago. And they must all by now have either reached or be reaching the retirement age of 60. And but they were the most conspicuous group. The others were much more individuals. A doctor here, a mathematician there, and others. I'm afraid I don't remember terribly well who the others were. Maybe Lucian Harris was one of them. But then there were others who didn't come. Nat Goldenberg didn't come, and there was a man whom I remember who was called Dr. Bernard Sandler of Manchester. He was a doctor, and he didn't come. I'm not sure I can remember any other names at the moment.
Okay, I understand that by 1949, Patra was brought into the orbit of the Jewish Agency's Youth and Chalutz department. And moments ago, you said that you weren't the Chalutz, you weren't intending to be Chalutzim. You came as professional and technical workers. What was Patra's attitude to the whole aspect of Chalutziut?
Look, the Chalutzim in England in those days were an entirely different kind of person. They were people who were going in for agricultural work and who went on Hachshara. There were several Hachshara farms in England, and that's what they did. And then when they came here, they went and joined a kibbutz, Kfar Blum, Kfar Nasi, and other places. That was the part of the worldwide Chalutz movement. In 1949, as you say, there was. We obviously were not going to continue to run Patwa as a voluntary organisation from here. It was none of our business. Meantime, we'd come here and we'd settled here. But Patwa was by this time had become something quite considerable. Anyway, considerable enough for the Jewish agency to want to adopt it and incorporate it in its own organisation and in its own work. And we were only too glad to let it.
I see. To go on to another question, you taught German language and literature at Oxford in the 30s, and beforehand I understand you studied in Oxford. Can you tell us about being Jewish and involved in Zionist activities at Oxford and relationships with the non-Jewish world? And could you also include in this the question of, if it existed, anti-Semitism in Oxford during the years you studied and taught there?
Look, I don't think I can tell you very much about any of those things. I went up to Oxford in 1928, incidentally, I didn't go up as a German scholar. I went up as a classical scholar. My field was Greek and Latin, and later on, during the time that I was in Oxford, I think about 1930, I switched over to German, and particularly German philology. And ultimately, I taught things like Old High German and Middle High German and Old Saxon and all kinds of things, which I've completely forgotten. Completely forgotten now. Looked to be there were not a great number of Jewish students at Oxford in those days. I believe today there are far more, and there were hardly any Jewish dons. In fact, I doubt whether there were more than one or two. Oxford is a very un-Jewish place. However, there was a small synagogue which had been built many years before in a very obscure corner of a very obscure street, of a very obscure part of Oxford. But anyway, there it was, and the synagogue was run by the students. The students conducted the services, and I can't really remember now to what extent I attended those services or didn't. But anyway, the synagogue was there, and it was a sort of center in a very simple or primitive and really unimportant way of such Jewish life as there was at that time. But for example, the Oxford University Jewish Society did not meet at the synagogue. It met at different times in the rooms of different members of the society. As I think I told you at the start, I was a member of that society. I think I became its secretary, and I became its president, and I remember organizing meetings and organizing the programs. But all this was just part of a very ordinary activity, which was natural in a university where there were lots of different societies. I remember we had a program, a card printed every single term, and it was sent to every Jewish undergraduate at the university that we knew of, and some of them came and some of them didn't, and we did the best we could. I don't know what I can tell you about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism exists in every single part of the Judeo-Christian world. It takes different forms in different countries according to the culture of those countries, and anti-Semitism, of course, existed in England, as it still does, as it does everywhere else in the world. I don't think any of us were too excited about it or too upset by it, and I don't myself remember any great manifestations of it, but what I can say is that we were naturally aware of it, and it was the sort of thing one one lived with. If some people were more thick-skinned, some people were less thick-skinned. I think I was probably among the less thick-skinned. But anyway, I don't think there's anything very special or remarkable I can tell you.
Okay, can we turn to Zionism in general? How well organized do you think Zionism was in Anglo-Jewry by the time of the outbreak of the Second World War? And how strong, for example, within the community were the non-Zionists, as perhaps typified by the AJA, and the anti-Zionists?
Honestly, I couldn't tell you. Look, you're asking me about things that happened 50 years ago. How can you expect me to remember what happened 50 years ago? I remember there was the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. I remember the name of its Secretary General was Paul Goodman, because his son, Maurice Goodman, was at school with me in London during the 1920s. How well organized or not well organized it was, I haven't a faint idea.
Can you give impressions and evaluate the role of some leading Anglo-Jewish figures that you might have come in contact, if I may name a few? Did you ever come in contact, well, first of all, with a non-Jewish Gentile Zionist, with Blanche Dugdale?
I knew Blanche Dugdale very well, because what I should have said is, I think, that round about 1934 or 1935, I started helping, let's say, with the World Zionist Organization. And I helped Dr. Weizmann, and I helped, and there was Professor Prudetsky, and there was Berlocker. There were all kinds of people like that. Professor Nehme, and Blanche Dugdale was one of them. And I used to go pretty regularly to the Zionist Organization's office at 77 Great Russell Street. And in fact, at one time, I worked there for, I think, something like a 6-month period, filling in for, I can't remember whether it was for Arthur Lurie or for Joe Linton, but anyway, for quite a considerable time. Blanche Dugdale, I don't really know what to say about her. She was a remarkable character because, as you say, she was not Jewish. She was the niece of Lord Balfour, and I imagine that fact exerted a great influence on her life and on her views. She was completely a part of Dr. Weizmann's inner circle, and everything was discussed with her without the slightest hesitation. I mean, there was no feeling ever that here is somebody who is not Jewish, and therefore the really intimate things and the really important things we will have to discuss without her. On the contrary, the more important problems were, the more she was drawn into the discussion. And as she had a great deal of experience of public life in England, her contribution was really extremely useful. She used to be at the office every single day. I remember very clearly.
So you mean if one is quoting, for example, from her diaries, that would be a very reliable source?
100%.
There were other names, but I'll leave for a moment because you mentioned that you did spend some time at Great Russell Street, and we wanted to know if you could perhaps evaluate Weizmann and his relationship with the local Zionist leadership, and how this interrelated with the world Zionist leadership in London. And perhaps can you bring in with this, evaluate the roles of people like Louis Namier and Locker, and the role of the Jewish Agency's political department in London?
Look, you're asking me much too much. I can't. I don't remember anything about the interplay between Dr. Weizmann and the local Zionist leadership. I think the man who was most nearly in both camps was probably Professor Brodetsky, because he was a member of the executive of the World Zionist Organization, and he played an active role in Jewish life in Britain at the time. He ultimately became president of the board of deputies. So I think he was the one who had his 2 feet in the 2 camps, if you can call them 2 camps, more than anybody else. Namier was the intellectual. Namier was an extraordinary man. In fact, the closest connection, the most intimate personal connection that existed was between Professor Namier and Mrs. Dugdale. They were great friends. They had a great deal respect for each other and for each other's brains, and I think rightly so. Look, I'll tell you a story about Professor Nemir, which probably nobody else will be able to tell you. Nemir, for all his intellectual eminence, and he was the leading British historian of the time, was also a very, very, very sincere, down-to-earth Zionist, and used to do the kind of thing which simple Zionists did. One of the things that simple Zionists did in those days was to try to support Jewish enterprise in Palestine by encouraging the sale of products. And I remember in particular Shemen products. Shemen oil and shaving cream and toothpaste and soap and stuff like that. That was thought of that was a form of Zionist endeavor. And I remember one day I came up to London from Oxford, and Nemir said to me, look, do you need any soap or shaving cream or toothpaste? I was going back to Oxford that afternoon by the, I think it was a 4:45 train, and he said, and I said, yes, I can do with some of that stuff. So he said, well, I'll bring it to you. And I remember the great Professor Louis Nemir met me at Paddington Station in London, bringing with him, I can't now remember how much soap and how much toothpaste, but anyway, he brought these Shemen products. I paid for them on the platform, number 1 platform, I remember very clearly, at Paddington Station, and I went off to Oxford, and he went back to his own place. In other words, he was by no means above doing that kind of very simple thing, which to me was a sign of greatness in the man.
Certainly. Do you know, can you say anything about Leonard Stein?
Not really. I knew Leonard Stein. He was a fairly distant sort of man. I don't think he was on very good terms with anybody, as far as I can remember. He was. I don't know how actively he was involved in the discussions and the decisions of the Zionist organization. He was respected. He was a scholar. He was the man who wrote the classic on the Balfour Declaration. But and in fact, I knew him rather well. I knew all these people very well. But I'm not sure that today there's anything special I can tell you about him.
How about Neville Lasky?
Neville Lasky I knew very well, and I got to know him better still because at one stage during the war, he and his family came to live in Oxford, and on my day off, as my family was in Oxford, I used to go there, and I used to see Neville Lasky regularly. Neville Lasky was a man who enjoyed life. He was a lawyer. He was a KC. In other words, he was a distinguished lawyer. But he was nothing like his brother. His brother Harold Lasky I really hardly knew. But Harold Lasky was a man with very clear political leanings, very strong left-wing leanings. He was a scholar. He was a professor at the London School of Economics. And Neville Lasky had none of that. He was a man who, I think, made a good deal of money as a lawyer. I remember him really as a man who enjoyed the good things of life, and the good things of life for people like him were the usual things: good food, women, amusements, the usual kind of thing. Whereas Harold Lasky was a much more retired professor type of man. But Neville Lasky was devoted to what you might call the Jewish cause. In fact, he was, I think, one of the presidents of the Board of Deputies before Brodetsky, and I knew him in that capacity as well. Maybe I should say that at one stage in my life, I was elected the representative of Oxford, of the Oxford Jewish community, on the Board of Deputies, and for maybe, I can't remember now how long, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, I was a member of the board of deputies, and I remember making at least one speech there, but that was that.
How about somebody completely different? How about Basil Enriquez? Do you have anything to do with him?
I knew Basil Enriquez, but he was a very distant figure because he was not a Zionist at all.
No, he was absolutely anti-Zionist.
Exactly, he must have been an outspoken anti-Zionist. He was devoted to Jewish welfare work in the East End of London. He established that settlement in the East End, and he was what you might call a British Jew to all intents and purposes, and that was how he saw his role. I remember very well, though I can't say that I ever knew him very well.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, perhaps?
Not really. Once you start reminiscing, you can start talking about 100 different things. One could talk about the extraordinary Jewish community that there was in Oxford during the war, yes, because it was composed of refugees from Germany and other European countries, and the people who were evacuated by the British government, women, old people, sick people, children, from London, in order to put them in a safe place. And the evacuation from London happened immediately on the outbreak of war, starting on September 3rd, 1939, and during that first year of the war I was still in Oxford. And it meant a tremendous job of organizing things for them. As I say, we just had this small synagogue, but we had absolutely no kind of communal organization. We did, however, have a cemetery, and in that cemetery no one had been buried for a very, very, very long time, because of the few Jews there were in Oxford, practically all of them were students, all of them were undergraduates, and undergraduates don't die. In fact, the only
That's okay now.
who've been killed in a road accident. Well, as among the categories of people who were evacuated from London, there were the sick. All of a sudden we started getting Jews from London in the Radcliffe Infirmary, which is a big hospital in Oxford, and some of them were very ill, and some of them were dying, and some of them died. And we had to look after that. We were simply not equipped for that. But somehow or other we improvised, and I taught myself how to wash dead bodies in the proper Jewish way, and I found one or two. It's the sort of job you can't do by yourself. You need a couple of people to help you, and I remember finding a couple of people, both of whom were refugees from Germany, who helped with that. And also people started to want to get married, and there had never previously been any marriages in the synagogue in Oxford. In order to have a synagogue wedding, the community had to have, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was called something like the marriage officer. The marriage officer had to be approved and appointed by the Registrar General. So I got myself appointed as the marriage officer of the Jewish community, and I began marrying couples. And then I took an active part in the services because we had to cater for a considerable number of people. In fact, during that year, I think I did about everything that one can possibly do in the Jewish community, except that I never circumcised any baby, and I never slaughtered any animal. But apart from those two things, I think that about everything that could possibly be done, or everything could possibly be needed in a Jewish community, I did, and I got people to help me. But in the end, especially as I left to go on war service, and the job simply became too big simply for it to be run on a volunteer basis, a minister was appointed, and the minister was a man called Jacob Weinberg, the Reverend Jacob Weinberg, who was the son of a rather well-known rabbi in the East End of London called Rabbi Weinberg. And during the whole of the war, the Reverend Jack Weinberg looked after the Jewish community in Oxford, and he afterwards became the rabbi of Edinburgh, and he still writes to me every single year for Rosh Hashanah, and he retired from his rabbinate at Edinburgh just 2 or 3 years ago. In the meantime, he'd been the rabbi of a community called Muizenberg or something like that, near Cape Town in South Africa. Anyway, after that first year, 1939-40, the conduct of Jewish affairs at Oxford was put on what you might call a regular basis with a proper appointed minister who ran everything. I tried as far as I could to get my weekly day off on Saturdays so that I could be home with the family, and because I was, after all, concerned for the Jewish community, I used to go, at that time, I used to go to the synagogue on Saturday mornings, and among the people there are just two whom perhaps I might mention. One was Lord Samuel, the High Commissioner, the man who had been High Commissioner of Palestine, and who also came to live in Oxford during the war. And he and his wife were regular weekly synagogue attendants. And the other was Rabbi Louis Rabinovitz, who now lives in Jerusalem,
Yes.
and who used to preach excellent sermons for on suitable occasions in the Oxford synagogue. Those are the two people I remember best. There was an extraordinary collection of people in Oxford at that time, and we organized them. We organized Keren Kayemet work. We saw to it that every single Jewish house in Oxford had a blue box.
My God, who's we? The Jewish the Jewish society.
We, although I shouldn't say this really means I, but as I said, for every different activity, I found helpers.
Yes.
So I can't remember the names of the people
I
now.
understand.
It was a question of taking initiative and organizing, and once you organize the thing moves along by itself, and all you have to do is to take part to some extent and keep an eye on it, and so on. Those are my recollections of that
When
period.
all these people brought to Oxford, where did they live? Were evacuation hostels set up?
No, they were mostly they were billeted on
families.
families, and some people simply rented flats or houses. I can't remember now where the Samuels lived, but they must have taken a flat in Oxford.
Yes.
Among the people who came was my father. He got a flat in Oxford, and I imagine people made their own arrangements. But the people who were evacuated by the government, they were billeted with families. Because the government had previously, years before, made a whole sort of census of people who had room and how many people were living in each house, and they knew where the people who could take in people from London.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.